This project came about because a couple of my clients were looking for a couple of benches to go with a dining room table that they had at their home. The table was some sort of oak with a barnwood leg, and the pecan that I had in the shop matched it pretty close. The first step in the process is to mill up the pecan. The stack that I have is rough sawn. I bought it from a friend who got it from somebody that he knew who had left it in a kiln for about 10 years. I like using it for projects like this because the grain pattern tends to match a lot of other different woods. It goes well with everything from maple even to heart pine or knotty pine. And I've even used it in conjunction with walnut and it looks pretty good. Sometimes it's hard to find, it depends on the area that you live in, but I do recommend it if you're building furniture. The next step in the process was to joint one side. This wasn't to get a square edge at this point, it was mostly to just get a flat edge to go against the table saw fence. These boards had a little bit of a warp in them, and so I wanted to cut them oversized but needed something straight to reference against the fence. I ended up going with about 5 inches, I think, instead of the 4 inches that I was looking for as my final, so that I would still have some room to work with. Once all the boards were ripped down to that rough width, I could go ahead and put them back through the joiner to get a flat, wide face. My joiner is only 6 inches wide and it's a 3/4 horsepower, so it struggles with this. But it was able to do it, I just had to take my time. Once I got finished joining the flat faces on each of the boards, I could then take them over to my planer to get a parallel flat face on them. Because of the cup and the warp in the boards, the first couple of passes through the planer, I was mostly just planing air. But I did end up getting them flat. They came out around 11/16 or so, just a little over 5/8. Pecan is pretty dense, so I wasn't really worried about the thickness. I like to use a joiner plane or joiner hand plane to take the tool marks off from where they went over the mechanical joiner earlier. This is a number 7 record. And one of the tricks that I use is taking a small piece of maple and clamping it to the side of the plane. I know that piece is square and I know the side of the plane is square, so it helps me get not just the tool marks out, but it helps me leave a square edge on the top. Something that I know that I can reference off of. Sometimes using a plane like that on something that's that narrow, it tends to rot. The next step was to put biscuits in, and these weren't for strength near as much as they were for alignment. Because I came out at about 5/8 thick, I wanted to make sure that I didn't have to take off any more than was necessary on the drum sander. Because I took my time joining these and doing the milling, the glue up went really straightforward. I used pipe clamps just because I like using pipe clamps, but bar clamps would have been just as good. They the pieces set together perfectly flat. I try to get as much of the squeeze out off as I can before the glue sets up. The drum sander will rip the belts to pieces on dried glue, and so I have to take off as much of it as I can before I send it through there, and it's easiest when it's dry. My drum sander has a variable drive belt, and at this point I think it was actually only going about 10 inches per minute, running 120 grit drum. The thing works fairly well, you just have to be pretty patient with it. After that, I went ahead and got the two tops down to their final dimensions and squared them up. And then it was time to start work on the base. A couple of years ago, I was given the opportunity to take down a local barn that some friends of mine own. And it was a surprise to me to see all the different types of woods that were used. Today, for structure or for barns like that, we would typically use white pine in my area of the United States. But this had a lot of poplar in it and a lot of oak, and the ridge beam is actually a piece of walnut about 3 inches thick and about 8 inches wide. The legs for this all ended up being out of the same piece of poplar, and I made the skirt boards out of a few pieces of barnwood oak. Once I got my spacing down, it was time to start milling up the barnwood. The process was pretty similar to milling up the top out of pecan, except I didn't send it through the joiner a second time and didn't plane it to get any kind of parallel face. We wanted to leave that circle saw mark on it. There are several mills in town that still actually do this, so I can get this new and use something like a T or a stain to get it that color. But since I have some of the actual real barnwood in the shop, I figured I would use that. I put one straight edge on it to reference against the table saw fence, and then cut it to its final width. Because of the design of the dining room table at the client's house, they have these small triangular pieces in the corners that provide structure for the legs, and I wanted to replicate that in the skirt to make it match a little bit better. To do that, I plunged down into the center of the board, and this is safe if you take your time with it and pay attention to what's going on. You can see on the fence I put a couple of small pencil lines, and that tells me where to pull up so that I don't cut through too far. I went ahead and extended my lines out with a pencil, and then it was off to the bandsaw to finish out the cut. I probably could have cut the whole thing on the bandsaw, but the table saw provides a much straighter line. I repeated this process for all of the other skirt boards and then used a pocket hole bit in the drill press to drill straight down. I don't use pocket holes very often, but I do like the screws, that flat head that they have on them, combined with the fact that they are very hard, make them ideal for building furniture. I decided to dowel the skirt into the legs, and you can see here I'm marking the location of the holes. This was kind of arbitrary as long as it matched up between the skirt and the leg. I put 2 holes in each of the skirt boards, but I ended up actually only using one. Because of the nature of barnwood not being straight or flat, I wanted the flexibility to be able to spin the leg. I ended up countersinking a screw in to provide the second point of contact. I've got a set of brad point bits with a collar on it that I use to drive these holes in. I do have a doweling jig, but since I wanted to offset the hole on the leg, and because the skirt wasn't entirely flat, I knew it wasn't going to center up right. Once I got the dowel holes drilled, it was a simple matter of gluing it up and putting it together. The glue up was actually a bit of a challenge because I had 2 holes in there for 2 dowels. I went ahead and put 2 dowels in to start out with, and ended up having to take the whole thing apart and cut one of the dowels off before then realizing that I could just countersink a screw in through the bottom into the miter there. Once I had that done, I used the bar clamp and clamped it together, and then set all 4 sets of these off to the side to dry overnight. When I came in the next morning, I made the 4 smaller pieces, which was the same process, just in miniature. I ended up cutting them out entirely on the bandsaw. And this time I only drove in 1 hole for a dowel. This stage of the glue up went significantly easier. The only issue that I knew I was going to have was that it would be difficult to get the screw into that smaller area because of the length of the drill. I ended up borrowing a right-hand drill from a friend of mine and used that, and that went pretty well. I did end up clamping them together for a little while and let them sit while I finished the 2 tops. Pecan is surprising every time. It just has a wonderful golden tone to it naturally that really is accentuated by any kind of finish. This here is just a simple wipe-on polyurethane that I'm using. Once I got the finish on both of the tops and let it dry for a little while, the final step was to just drive the screws in to attach the skirt to the top. And then it was time for delivery. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. It really does help.